New York City didn't always shine with glass towers and electric light. In the 1800s, it was a city of mud-soaked streets, horse-drawn chaos, smoke-filled docks, and neighborhoods stacked tightly with immigrants chasing survival. The air smelled of coal and salt water. The streets echoed with cartwheels, shouting vendors, and church bells competing for attention. This was a city growing faster than it could control itself. Tonight, you're not learning about New York, you're walking through it, exactly as it was 2 centuries ago. The first glimpse of New York in the 1800s did not come from grand buildings or wide avenues. It came from the water. Ships creaked and groaned as they eased into the harbor, their wooden hulls scarred from long Atlantic crossings. The air was thick with salt, coal smoke, and the sharp scent of tar. Seagulls circled overhead, crying out as if announcing each arrival to the city itself. For those standing on deck, gripping the rail with stiff, weathered hands, this was not just a port, it was the edge of the known world and the beginning of something entirely uncertain. South Street Seaport was chaos given form. Dozens of vessels crowded the docks at any given moment. Merchant ships heavy with goods, immigrant ships emptied of hope and sickness, fishing boats returning with their daily catch. Sailors shouted in multiple languages as ropes were thrown and secured. Dock workers moved with practiced speed, hauling crates of sugar, coffee, rum, cotton, and timber. Everything smelled alive, urgent, and unfinished. New York did not welcome newcomers gently. It overwhelmed them first. Immigrants stepped onto the planks cautiously, legs unsteady after weeks at sea. Many had left behind famine, war, or poverty, so severe it erased any real choice. Irish families fleeing hunger, German craftsmen escaping political turmoil, and later waves from Italy and Eastern Europe all passed through this same narrow threshold. They carried everything they owned in battered trunks or cloth bundles. Some held children close, whispering reassurances they did not fully believe themselves. Others stood silently, eyes wide, trying to understand the scale of the city rising beyond the waterfront. The docks were loud, but not joyful. There was no ceremonial welcome, no sense of relief. Instead, officials barked instructions, inspectors glanced quickly at faces and papers, and shipping agents circled like hunters, offering work or passage inland for a price. Scammers blended seamlessly into the crowd, preying on those who spoke little English. A wrong turn here could mean being cheated, robbed, or trapped in debt before even reaching the city streets. Behind the docks, Lower Manhattan loomed dense, unfinished, restless. Church spires pierced the skyline, rising above tightly packed buildings that seemed to lean toward the water. Narrow streets twisted inward like veins, pulling people into the heart of the city, whether they were ready or not. There were no skyscrapers yet, no defining silhouettedly layers of brick, wood, and ambition stacked as high as construction methods would allow. The waterfront itself never slept. By day, it pulsed with movement, carts rattling over uneven boards, barrels rolling, men shouting measurements and destinations. By night, lanterns flickered in the fog, casting long, distorted shadows across the planks. Taverns near the docks, filled with sailors and laborers, their laughter mixing with arguments and exhaustion. Fights were common, so were disappearances. For many newcomers, the docks were both their first lesson and their first warning about life in America. Disease lurked everywhere. Cholera, typhus, and smallpox traveled quietly among passengers who had already survived the sea. Medical inspections were brief and often ineffective. Those deemed too sick were separated, sometimes sent away, sometimes left with nowhere to go. Families could be split within minutes, never to reunite. The city's promise was real, but so was its cruelty. Yet even here, amid noise and confusion, hope persisted. Some immigrants fell to their knees upon arrival, praying in gratitude. Others stared upward, imagining futures that felt impossible back home. The docks represented something dangerous and powerful. Possibility. This was a city that did not care who you had been, only how much you could endure. Children watched everything. They learned quickly where to stand, when to speak, how to disappear into crowds when necessary. Many would soon be working themselves, selling newspapers, shining shoes, or hauling small loads for pennies. Childhood ended fast at the water's edge. Above it all, the city watched silently. New York in the 1800s was not yet the symbol of opportunity it would later become. It was raw, impatient, and constantly expanding. The docks were its mouth, swallowing people by the thousands and spitting them into streets that would test them relentlessly. Some would rise, many would struggle. A few would vanish into history without leaving a trace. As ships unloaded and newcomers stepped forward, the city did not pause to acknowledge them. Another vessel was already arriving, another crowd was forming. The tide kept moving, and so did New York. For those standing on the docks at South Street Seaport, this was not just an arrival, it was the moment their old lives truly ended, and the uncertainty of the new world began. Stepping away from the docks and into Lower Manhattan in the 1800s felt like entering a living organism, one that breathed, sweated, and groaned under its own weight. The streets were narrow and uneven, carved more by habit than by planning. Most were still dirt, turning into thick mud after rain and clouds of dust in dry weather. Horses, carts, and people all shared the same space, moving in unpredictable currents that never truly stopped. There were no sidewalks as we know them today, only worn edges of road where pedestrians tried to keep their footing. Open sewers ran alongside many streets, shallow channels carrying waste, animal droppings, and refuse toward the river. In summer, the smell was overpowering, a sour mix of rot and heat that clung to clothing and skin. In winter, these channels froze, trapping filth beneath thin sheets of ice. Residents learned to step carefully. One misstep could mean sickness or worse. Disease was not an abstract fear here. It was part of daily life, as common as hunger. Buildings crowded together as if competing for space. Wooden structures leaned against brick ones, and new floors were added whenever possible, often without concern for safety. Fires were frequent and devastating. A single spark could race through a block in minutes, fed by timber, coal, and tightly packed homes. Volunteer fire brigades rushed in with buckets and hand-pumped engines, but damage was almost always severe. Entire neighborhoods could vanish overnight. Tenements dominated much of Lower Manhattan. These were not homes built for comfort, but containers for labor. Families rented single rooms where parents, children, and sometimes boarders slept together. Windows were scarce, fresh air was rarer. In some buildings, dozens of people shared a single water pump and a few outdoor privies. Privacy did not exist. Every argument, cough, cry, and whispered prayer passed through thin walls and open doors. Children filled the streets. They ran barefoot between carts, learned to dodge horses before they could read, and worked wherever pennies could be earned. Some sold newspapers. Others scavenged coal fallen from wagons. Many labored in workshops or factories from dawn until nightfall. School was a luxury few could afford, and childhood was brief. The city demanded usefulness early. Street markets formed the lifeblood of daily survival. Vendors lined corners and alleys with wooden stalls, selling vegetables, fish, bread, and scraps of meat. Prices changed by the hour, depending on supply, weather, and rumor. Shouts echoed constantly, calls in English, Irish accents, German phrases, and countless other languages blending into a sound unique to the city. Bargaining was expected. Trust was not. Food quality varied wildly. Fresh produce arrived from nearby farms, but preservation was unreliable. Spoilage was common, and adulteration was rampant. Milk was often watered down. Bread could contain chalk or sawdust. Still, people bought what they could afford. Hunger outweighed caution. The streets were also places of connection. Immigrants clustered near others who spoke their language or shared their customs. Entire blocks took on distinct identitizers, neighborhoods, German enclaves, later Italian streets. These communities offered protection, familiarity, and shared survival. Churches, taverns, and social halls became anchors in an otherwise unstable world. Crime was woven into the rhythm of the streets. Pickpockets worked crowded markets. Gangs controlled territories, especially at night. Law enforcement existed, but it was inconsistent and often corrupt. Many residents relied on neighbors rather than authorities. Street justice was quick and sometimes brutal. At night, gas lamps cast weak halos of light, leaving most of the street in shadow. Taverns glowed warmly, spilling laughter and music onto the road. Theaters and dance halls offered brief escape from grinding reality. But darkness also brought danger. Respectable families stayed inside if they could. Those who walked did so quickly, eyes forward, senses alert. Despite the hardship, ambition pulsed everywhere. Small shops opened in front rooms. Tailors, bakers, and shoemakers worked endlessly, hoping to rise just one step above survival. Success stories circulated like legends, someone who saved enough to move uptown, someone whose children learned to read, someone who escaped the tenements entirely. These stories kept people going. Lower Manhattan in the 1800s was not beautiful by modern standards. It was crowded, unsanitary, and harsh. Yet it was alive with energy unmatched anywhere else in the young nation. Every street carried thousands of private struggles and quiet dreams. The city did not make life easy, but it made movement possible. Walking these streets meant learning quickly where to buy, where to avoid, whom to trust, and how to endure. This was the daily reality for the majority of New Yorkers. Before wealth, before grandeur, before the skyline, there were these streets, and on them the city was being built, one exhausted step at a time. Life for the working class in 19th century New York was defined by motion without rest. From before sunrise until long after dark, men, women, and children moved through the city in an endless cycle of labor, exhaustion, and necessity. Work was not a path to fulfillment, it was a requirement for survival. Missing a single day's wages could mean hunger, eviction, or worse. For most, there was no safety net. The city demanded effort, and it demanded it daily. Factories rose quickly across Lower Manhattan and nearby districts, filling the air with smoke and noise. Inside, conditions were harsh and relentless. Machines roared without pause, belts spun dangerously close to exposed limbs, and ventilation was poor. Workers stood for hours, repeating the same motions until their hands blistered and their backs ached beyond pain. Accidents were common, fingers were lost, limbs were crushed. When injuries happened, the job rarely waited. Another worker simply stepped in. Pay was low and unpredictable. Employers could reduce wages without warning, and there were always others desperate enough to accept less. Immigrants, especially recent arrivals, had little bargaining power. Many did not speak English fluently and relied on foremen or labor agents who often exploited them. A job could disappear overnight, leaving entire families scrambling to survive. Child labor was not an exception, it was an expectation. Children as young as 6 or 7 worked in factories, workshops, and street trades. Small hands were considered useful for reaching into machinery or sorting materials. Their days were long, their pay minimal. Education was secondary, if considered at all. Many children learned to read signs and coins before they learned letters. The streets raised them quickly, and the city hardened them early. Women made up a significant portion of the workforce, especially in garment factories, laundries, and domestic service. Seamstresses worked in dim rooms, hunched over fabric for endless hours, often paid by the piece. Speed determined survival. A slow day meant less food. Domestic workers lived inside the homes of wealthier families, isolated from their own communities, but still working from dawn until night. Their labor was invisible, yet constant. Immigrant neighborhoods became centers of shared endurance. Families crowded into tenements, not only because of poverty, but because proximity offered support. Neighbors shared information about jobs, warned each other of dishonest employers, and watched children when parents worked late. Languages, traditions, and customs survived here, even as the pressure to adapt never faded. These neighborhoods were noisy, crowded, and worn, but they were alive with connection. Daily routines followed rigid patterns. Before dawn, workers left cramped rooms, stepping into cold streets or humid air depending on the season. Breakfast was simple, if it existed at all: bread, leftover scraps, weak tea. Lunch was eaten quickly, often beside machines or on the street. Dinner came late and was shared in exhaustion. Sleep was short. Tomorrow always came too soon. Illness was constant. Overcrowding and poor sanitation meant sickness spread rapidly. If a worker fell ill, there was no paid leave. Families depended on neighbors or older children to step into work roles temporarily. Many did not recover. Death was an accepted presence, mourned briefly before routine resumed. The city did not slow down for grief. Despite everything, pride existed. Workers took quiet dignity in endurance, in providing for family, in surviving another week. Labor unions began to form, fragile and often crushed by employers or authorities, but the idea of collective strength slowly took hold. Strikes erupted occasionally, demanding shorter hours or better pay. Most failed. Some planted seeds that would grow decades later. Moments of relief were rare but cherished. Sundays offered brief rest. Churches filled with worn faces seeking comfort. Music drifted from open windows. Taverns offered warmth and escape, though often at the cost of tomorrow's wages. Laughter still existed, even in hardship. So did dreams, quiet, fragile, but persistent. The working class built New York with their bodies. They laid bricks, stitched clothing, hauled goods, cleaned streets, and powered factories. Their names rarely entered records. Their lives rarely became stories. Yet without them, the city would not have risen. Every street, every building, every institution depended on their labor. Life was not romantic. It was not heroic in the moment. It was repetitive, painful, and uncertain. But within that struggle was resilience. The working class endured because they had no alternative. And in that endurance, they shaped the city more profoundly than any politician or industrialist ever could. This was the true engine of 19th century New York, not wealth or ambition alone, but the relentless, unseen effort of millions who woke each day knowing survival itself was the only goal. As the working class strained under long hours and narrow lives, another New York was quietly taking shape farther north. It was a city defined not by survival, but by accumulation. In the early to mid-1800s, wealth began to separate itself physically from poverty, moving away from the crowded streets of Lower Manhattan and climbing northward along newly planned avenues. Nowhere was this shift more visible than along Fifth Avenue, a stretch of land that would soon become a symbol of power, status, and distance from the struggles below. Fifth Avenue did not begin as a boulevard of luxury. At first, it was simply open land farms, scattered homes, and undeveloped plots bordering the growing city. But as commerce expanded and fortunes were made through shipping, banking, railroads, and manufacturing, the wealthy sought space, air, and separation. They wanted distance from the noise, disease, and disorder of downtown life. Fifth Avenue offered exactly that: room to build, and room to distinguish themselves. Early mansions rose one by one, massive compared to the cramped tenements left behind. Built of stone and brick, with iron gates and wide setbacks, these homes were designed to impress and intimidate. Columns, grand staircases, and ornate interiors reflected European influence and old-world aspirations. These families did not see themselves as merely rich, they saw themselves as New York's new aristocracy. Inside these homes, life followed a different rhythm entirely. Servants handled cooking, cleaning, and childcare. Meals were formal affairs, served on fine china beneath gaslit chandeliers. Music rooms hosted private performances. Libraries displayed education and refinement. Comfort was assumed. Hardship was distant. The city's noise faded behind thick walls and guarded entrances. This rise of wealth made class division impossible to ignore. While the working class lived stacked floor upon floor, sharing water pumps and struggling to breathe clean air, the wealthy lived in single-family homes with private gardens and fresh breezes. Distance became a statement. Where you lived defined who you were and who you were not. Social rules hardened alongside architecture. Invitations mattered. Family names mattered. Marriages became strategic, binding fortunes together. Old money and new money eyed each other carefully, competing for influence and legitimacy. Charity existed, but it was controlled, selective, and often public acts of generosity that reinforced hierarchy rather than erased it. The streets around Fifth Avenue reflected this shift. They were wider, cleaner, and better maintained. Horse-drawn carriages replaced crowded foot traffic. Shops catered to luxury rather than necessity. Dress alone marked difference. Tailored suits, silk dresses, polished shoes, even posture changed. Confidence was worn openly here. Yet this wealth did not exist in isolation. It was built directly on the labor of the city below. The factories, docks, workshops, and markets fueled the fortunes that funded these mansions. Every shipment unloaded, every garment stitched, every mile of rail laid added another layer of comfort uptown. The city was connected but unevenly rewarded. Tension simmered beneath the surface. Workers could see the symbols of wealth rising beyond their reach. Carriages passed through poorer districts, reminding residents daily of the gap between effort and reward. Riots and protests occasionally erupted, fueled by economic pressure and resentment. The wealthy responded by retreating further, reinforcing separation rather than engagement. Central Park, conceived during this period, symbolized both unity and division. It was designed as a shared green space, a place where all classes could find relief from urban density. But even here, class boundaries persisted. The wealthy arrived by carriage, strolling in fine clothing. The poor came on foot, aware of the contrast. The park offered beauty, but it did not erase inequality. By the late 1800s, the pattern was clear. New York was no longer a single, shared experience. It was multiple cities layered on top of one another, one of struggle, one of ambition, and one of established power. Fifth Avenue stood as a visible line between them, not just geographically, but socially and psychologically. The rise of wealth changed how New York saw itself. It became a city of opportunity and excess, of innovation and imbalance. For some, the city represented triumph. For others, it remained a test of endurance. Both realities existed simultaneously, separated by a few miles and an impossible distance. This era marked the beginning of modern New York's identity, a place where fortunes could be made rapidly, displayed openly, and defended fiercely. The mansions of Fifth Avenue were not just homes, they were declarations. And as they rose, the city's divisions became permanent features of its landscape, visible, measurable, and impossible to ignore. New York's growth in the 1800s was not accidental. It was pulled outward, mile by mile, by the movement of people. Transportation became the force that reshaped the city's boundaries, turning what had once been a compact port into an expanding urban organism. As the population surged, the city stretched northward, crossing old limits and redefining what it meant to live in New York. In the early part of the century, most movement happened on foot. Workers walked long distances every day, from overcrowded neighborhoods to factories, docks, and workshops. Distance mattered. Living too far from work could mean exhaustion before the day even began. But as the city grew denser, walking was no longer enough. New solutions emerged, reshaping daily life. Horse-drawn streetcars, often called horse cars, became one of the first major breakthroughs. Running along iron rails embedded in the street, these cars could carry dozens of passengers at once, pulled by teams of horses. They were slow by modern standards, but revolutionary at the time. For the first time, ordinary New Yorkers could travel farther without sacrificing all their energy. Neighborhoods once considered remote suddenly became accessible. These horse cars followed fixed routes, connecting residential areas with commercial centers. With them came schedules, stops, and a new sense of time discipline. People began structuring their days around transit. The city's rhythm changed. Work and home no longer had to exist within walking distance of each other. This separation allowed the city to spread outward, block by block. Ferries were equally vital. Surrounded by water, New York relied heavily on river crossings to connect Manhattan with Brooklyn, New Jersey, and beyond. Ferry terminals buzzed with activity from dawn to nightfall. Workers crowded aboard, standing shoulder to shoulder as boats cut through the water. These ferries made it possible for entire communities to form across the river while remaining tied to Manhattan's economy. Brooklyn, once a separate city, began to grow rapidly because of ferry access. Families seeking slightly cheaper rents and more space settled there. Commuting daily across the East River, the water no longer divided it, connected. This expansion reshaped the region, laying the groundwork for what would later become Greater New York. As the century progressed, early railroads pushed growth even further. Steam-powered trains connected the city to distant towns, farms, and industrial centers. Goods arrived faster. People traveled farther. The city's influence spread well beyond its original footprint. Rail terminals became new hubs of activity, drawing businesses, hotels, and housing around them. Within the city, elevated railways began to appear later in the century. Iron tracks rose above the streets, carrying trains over traffic and crowds. These structures were loud, darkening the streets below and showering sparks and soot as trains passed overhead. Yet they were embraced because they worked. Travel times shortened dramatically. Entire districts transformed almost overnight. Transportation did more than move people. It reshaped class boundaries. The wealthy could afford carriages or live closer to work. The working class relied on public transit, clustering along routes they could afford. Entire neighborhoods formed based on access to transportation. A new geography of opportunity emerged, determined by rails, roads, and water. Growth also brought strain. Streets designed for carts struggled under increased traffic. Horses filled the city with waste, contributing to sanitation problems. Accidents were common. Ferries collided. Streetcars derailed. Safety regulations lagged behind innovation. Progress came quickly, but not cleanly. Still, the expansion continued. As transit reached farther north, farmland disappeared beneath brick and stone. New streets were laid out in grids, extending endlessly toward the horizon. What had once been countryside became neighborhoods in a matter of years. The city consumed space relentlessly, driven by population pressure and economic momentum. Transportation also changed how New Yorkers understood distance. What once felt far now felt routine. Daily commutes grew longer, yet more manageable. The city became something you moved through rather than simply lived within. Motion defined urban life. By the end of the 1800s, New York was no longer just a port city. It was a network of rails, routes, ferries, and streets binding millions together in shared movement. Transportation did not merely serve the city, it created it. Every expansion outward was a declaration. New York would not stay contained. This era marked the transition from a crowded town into a sprawling metropolis. Horse, cars, ferries, and early railroads carried more than passengers. They carried ambition, reshaping the city's scale and its future. New York was growing not upward yet, but outward, preparing itself for the transformation still to come. New York in the 1800s was a city constantly on the brink. Order existed, but only just. Beneath the surface of daily labor and growth ran a current of chaos that could erupt without warning. Crime, fire, and unrest were not rare events, they were expected risks of urban life. For many residents, especially the poor, survival meant navigating not only poverty, but danger. Gangs flourished in the crowded neighborhoods of Lower Manhattan. They were often formed along ethnic or neighborhood lines, offering protection to members while threatening everyone else. Names like the Bowery Boys or the Dead Rabbits became whispered warnings. These gangs controlled streets, saloons, and voting blocks, extorting businesses and clashing violently with rivals. Loyalty was enforced through fear, and violence was a language everyone understood. Police forces existed, but they were small, inconsistent, and often corrupt. Many officers were underpaid and overmatched, facing neighborhoods where they were seen as outsiders or enemies. In some areas, gangs effectively replaced law enforcement, deciding who could pass safely and who could not. Justice was uneven, swift when convenient, and absent when it was not. Riots erupted with alarming frequency. Economic hardship, ethnic tension, political manipulation, and resentment toward the wealthy all contributed to unrest. A rumor, a speech, or a single incident could ignite streets already tense with frustration. Crowds formed quickly, fueled by anger and alcohol. Windows shattered, buildings burned, authority vanished. Some riots lasted days, leaving neighborhoods scarred and communities divided. Fire was an ever-present terror. The city was built largely of wood, packed tightly together, and lit by open flames and gas lamps. One accidental tipped candle, a spark from a stove, could destroy entire blocks. Fires spread faster than people could run. Smoke filled streets. Bells rang desperately as volunteers rushed to respond. Volunteer fire brigades were both heroes and hazards. These groups were often tied to neighborhoods or political factions, competing fiercely for control over fire scenes. Rival brigades sometimes fought each other instead of the flames, brawling in the streets while buildings burned behind them. Their courage was real, but so was the chaos they brought. Equipment was crude, water supply was unreliable, success was never guaranteed. For residents, fire meant sudden ruin. Families could lose everything in hours: home, possessions, livelihood. Insurance was limited or non-existent for the poor. After a fire, survivors often slept in the streets or crowded into already packed tenements. Rebuilding was slow, if it happened at all. Nightfall intensified fear. Gas lamps offered limited light, casting deep shadows that concealed threats. Crime increased after dark. Muggings, assaults, and theft were common. Respectable families locked doors early. Those who worked late or lived in dangerous areas learned to move quickly and quietly. The city belonged to whoever claimed it after sunset. Alcohol played a major role in the city's volatility. Taverns were everywhere, serving as social centers, political meeting places, and gang headquarters. Drunkenness fueled violence and disorder, but it also provided escape from relentless hardship. Attempts to control drinking often failed, meeting resistance from both workers and business owners. Despite the danger, communities developed their own systems of survival. Neighbors watched out for one another. Informal warnings spread quickly. Certain streets were avoided at certain hours. Trust was local and fragile, but essential. The city was dangerous, yet people adapted. These conditions shaped New York's identity. The constant presence of crime and disaster hardened residents, making resilience a necessity rather than a virtue. People learned to rebuild, to endure, and to accept instability as normal. The city did not promise safety, it promised opportunity, at a cost. By the late 1800s, reforms began to emerge. Professional fire departments replaced volunteers. Police forces expanded and standardized. Infrastructure slowly improved, but the memory of chaos lingered. New York had been forged in disorder, and that history left its mark. Crime, fire, and unrest were not side stories, they were central to the city's evolution. They tested institutions, shaped neighborhoods, and defined daily life. To live in New York in the 1800s was to accept risk as part of existence, to understand that stability was temporary, and that survival depended as much on awareness as on work. This was a city learning, painfully, how to govern itself. And in that struggle between order and chaos, modern New York began to take form. By the mid-1800s, New York was suffocating under its own success. Streets overflowed with people, animals, carts, and noise. Brick and stone pressed closer together each year, swallowing open land as quickly as it appeared. For many residents, especially those trapped in tenements, there was nowhere to breathe. The city was growing upward and outward, but not inward. It offered work, not relief. In this atmosphere, the idea of creating a massive public park at the heart of Manhattan felt almost absurd. The proposal for Central Park was radical. To set aside hundreds of acres of valuable land right in the path of the city's expansion for trees, grass, and open space seemed wasteful to critics. Developers saw profit slipping away. Property owners protested. Politicians argued. But reformers, doctors, and planners pushed back, warning that without green space, the city would choke itself. Disease, unrest, and exhaustion were already visible. Nature, they argued, was not a luxury, it was a necessity. Before Central Park existed, the land it would occupy was far from empty. Small communities lived there, including working-class families and free black residents in settlements like Seneca Village. There were rocky outcrops, marshy ground, scattered farms, and winding paths. Creating the park meant displacement. Homes were demolished. People were forced to leave. The park would become a symbol of public good, but it was built on private loss, a contradiction that lingered quietly beneath its beauty. Construction began in the 1850s, and the scale was enormous. Millions of cartloads of earth were moved, swamps were drained, hills were reshaped. What looked natural was carefully engineered. Designers envisioned a landscape that felt untouched, even though every curve, path, and pond was planned. Nature here would be controlled, refined, and framed an idealized version of the countryside many immigrants had left behind. Frederick Law, Olmsted, and Calvert Vaux imagined Central Park as a democratic space, a place where all classes could coexist peacefully. Wide promenades allowed carriage rides for the wealthy, while winding footpaths invited quieter reflection. Open lawns offered space to gather, to rest, to simply exist without being productive. This idea alone challenged the city's values. In a place defined by labor, the park suggested that rest mattered too. When the park opened in stages, New Yorkers arrived in waves. Some came out of curiosity, others came out of desperation. Working-class families walked miles on their single day off to reach it. Children ran freely for the first time without dodging carts or factory doors. For a few hours, the city loosened its grip. Yet class division did not disappear at the park gates. The wealthy arrived in carriages, dressed in their finest clothes, using the park as a place to be seen. Etiquette mattered. Certain areas felt unspokenly reserved. Working-class visitors were often reminded through stares, rules, or enforcement that they were guests in a space shaped by elite ideals. The park was public, but not equal. Still, Central Park changed the rhythm of the city. Sundays took on new meaning. Music performances, strolling, and quiet gatherings became part of urban life. The idea that a city could contain calm began to take root. Other cities watched closely. New York was setting a precedent. Growth did not have to mean total surrender to concrete and noise. The park also reshaped real estate. Properties bordering it became more valuable almost immediately. Wealth followed greenery. This was not accidental. Planners understood that the park would anchor elite neighborhoods and pull the city as center of gravity northward. Central Park was both a gift and a tool improving public health while quietly steering development. For immigrants and laborers, the park represented a different kind of promise. It was a rare space where they were not defined by their work or poverty. Even briefly, they could sit, walk, and watch the city without being consumed by it. Birds replaced machinery. Trees replaced brick. Silence, rare and fragile, became possible. Critics never fully disappeared. Some argued the part was too controlled, too polished, too distant from real wilderness. Others pointed to the people displaced, the money spent, the rules enforced. All of it was true. Central Park was not pure idealism. It was compromise, power, and vision tangled together. But despite its contradictions, Central Park endured. It survived neglect, overuse, and political shifts. It became part of New York's identity, not as decoration, but as relief. A reminder that even the most relentless city needs pause. In a Manhattan bursting at the seams, Central Park stood as a bold refusal to fill every space with profit. It declared that a city could grow without erasing all softness. And in doing so, it reshaped how New York imagined its future, not just as a place to work, but as a place to live. In the early 1800s, New York's skyline was not defined by height, but by intention. It rose modestly, shaped by function and faith, rather than ambition. Church spires pierced the air above crowded streets, acting as both spiritual markers and practical landmarks. From almost anywhere in the city, you could spot a steeple pointing upward, offering orientation in a maze of narrow roads. These spires were the tallest structures most New Yorkers would ever see, and, for a time, they were enough. Churches dominated the vertical imagination of the city. Built of stone and brick, they stood sturdier and taller than surrounding homes and shops. Their bells marked time in a city without universal clocks, signaling work hours, rest, and worship. In neighborhoods filled with uncertainty, churches offered a sense of permanence. They did not move. They did not vanish overnight. In a city of constant change, their height symbolized stability. Beyond the spires, most buildings remained low. Construction methods limited height, and safety concerns discouraged ambition. 3 to 5 stories was common. Anything taller was considered risky. Fire, wind, and structural collapse were real fears. The skyline stretched outward, not upward, rows of rooftops forming uneven lines rather than dramatic peaks. But change was already underway. Commerce demanded space. As businesses grew, so did the need for offices, storage, and coordination. Merchants wanted to be closer together, not spread out. This pressure began to subtly alter how the city built itself. Height became a solution. Early commercial buildings began adding floors. Warehouses near the waterfront rose higher than surrounding homes, their solid walls designed to hold goods rather than people. Banks and insurance companies built heavier, more imposing structures meant to inspire trust. Stone replaced wood. Iron reinforced brick. These were quiet innovations, barely noticed at first, but they mattered. Bridges added a new dimension to the skyline. The city's rivers, once barriers crossed only by ferry, became stages for engineering ambition. As plans emerged for permanent crossings, the idea of building upward gained legitimacy. Towers and cables would soon stretch across water, redefining what structures could do and how high they could rise. The Brooklyn Bridge, conceived in the late 1800s, embodied this shift even before it was completed. Its stone towers were unlike anything New York had seen. They were not religious. They were not residential. They were declarations of human capability. Even during construction, the bridge altered the skyline, signaling a future where height would represent progress rather than danger. Iron and steel began to change architecture itself. These materials allowed buildings to support more weight and reach greater heights. Elevators, still primitive, but improving, made upper floors practical rather than punishing. What had once been undesirable became valuable. Higher meant better light, cleaner air, and prestige. Class distinctions became vertical as well as horizontal. Taller buildings housed businesses and institutions, while the poor remained packed into low-rise tenements. Height began to signify power. Looking down became a privilege. Yet many New Yorkers viewed these changes with suspicion. Taller buildings cast longer shadows. They blocked light and airflow. They altered familiar views. Some feared the city was growing too fast, reaching beyond its limits. Others welcomed the transformation, seeing height as proof that New York was becoming something larger than itself. Artists and writers of the time captured this transition. The skyline, once simple, became layered. Church spires no longer stood alone. They competed with chimneys, towers, and commercial roofs. The city's outline grew more complex, less harmonious, but undeniably more ambitious. By the end of the 1800s, the idea of building upward no longer seemed reckless, it seemed inevitable. The skyline was no longer just a reflection of need. It was a reflection of desire. New York did not want to remain flat. It wanted to rise. These early hints of vertical ambition laid the foundation for what would come next. Skyscrapers were still in the future, but the mindset that would create them was already in place. The city had learned that height could be controlled, engineered, and monetized. The changing skyline told a story visible from afar. It spoke of a city outgrowing its past, testing its limits, and preparing to redefine what an urban landscape could be. From church spires to bridge towers, New York was learning how to look upward, and once it started, it would never stop. When night fell over New York in the 1800s, the city did not sleep, it transformed. Daylight's chaos softened into something more uncertain, more intimate, and often more dangerous. As the sun dipped below the rooftops, shadows stretched across narrow streets, and the city's true character emerged. Night revealed what daylight concealed: desire, desperation, and the thin line between pleasure and peril. Gas lamps flickered to life one by one, casting uneven pools of yellow light along major streets and intersections. They did not banish darkness, they negotiated with it. Between lamps lay long corridors of shadow, where faces disappeared and footsteps echoed without warning. The glow reflected off wet cobblestones, iron railings, and shop windows, creating a city that shimmered and threatened at the same time. For many working people, night was the only time that belonged to them. After exhausting days in factories, docks, and workshops, the evening offered brief escape. Taverns filled quickly. Wooden doors swung open to release warmth, smoke, laughter, and the sharp smell of alcohol. Inside, men crowded shoulder to shoulder, drinking cheap beer or spirits, sharing news, complaints, and rumors. Politics, work, and survival blurred together in loud conversations fueled by fatigue and drink. Taverns were more than drinking establishments. They were social centers, hiring halls, and unofficial courts. Deals were made, alliances formed, and conflicts sparked. Songs rose above the din, sometimes joyful, sometimes bitter, but alcohol also loosened tempers. Fights broke out easily, and knives were not uncommon. Many nights ended with blood on the floor and silence in the street outside. Theaters and entertainment halls offered a different escape. From modest playhouses to grander venues, performances drew crowds hungry for distraction. Melodramas, comedies, and musical acts played to packed rooms. Gaslight illuminated stages where actors exaggerated emotion to reach audiences seated far from the action. For a few hours, New Yorkers could forget hunger, labor, and fear, losing themselves in spectacle. These spaces were also places of mixing socially and morally. Men and women attended together, though expectations differed sharply by class. Respectable families occupied better seats. Working people filled balconies and standing areas. Outside, street performers and vendors added to the noise, turning entire blocks into corridors of entertainment. But not all nighttime activity was benign. Crime thrived after dark. Pickpockets worked theater crowds. Thieves lingered near taverns, watching for intoxicated victims. Gangs claimed territory more aggressively at night, enforcing control through intimidation. The absence of consistent lighting and policing made darkness an ally to those who understood it. For women, night carried particular risk. Respectability was fragile, and simply being seen alone after dark could invite judgment or danger. Many women worked at night nonetheless, as seamstresses finishing piecework, as servants cleaning after their employers retired, or in entertainment venues themselves. They moved carefully, aware that the city's rules changed once the sun set. Gas lamps also reshaped the city's rhythm. Shops stayed open later along well-lit streets, extending commerce into the evening. This created new patterns of movement, drawing people into areas that would have been deserted after sunset just decades earlier. Light meant possibility, but only where it reached. Beyond the main streets, darkness remained dominant. In poorer neighborhoods, lighting was sparse or non-existent. Tenement alleys swallowed sound. Children huddled indoors. Families barred doors and windows against threats, both real and imagined. Night amplified every fear already present in daylight. Police patrols increased after dark, but their reach was limited. Many officers walked alone, relying on familiarity and instinct. In some districts, they avoided certain streets entirely. Law enforcement was reactive rather than preventative. By the time help arrived, damage was often done. Despite the danger, nightlife persisted because it had to. The city's population was too dense, too restless, and too weary to retreat completely. Night was when stories were shared, music was made, and small freedoms were claimed. It was when the city exhaled. Seasonal changes altered the experience. In summer, Heat lingered after sunset, driving people outdoors. Streets filled with noise and movement long into the night. In winter, darkness arrived early, cold and heavy. Taverns and theaters became refuges from both weather and loneliness. Snow muffled sound, making the city feel both quieter and more ominous. Nightfall also highlighted inequality. Wealthier neighborhoods glowed brighter, better lit and more secure. Servants moved discreetly behind doors. Carriages rolled smoothly along cleaner streets. Meanwhile, poorer districts navigated darkness with little protection, relying on familiarity and luck. By midnight, the city thinned, but never emptied. Dock workers, night watchmen, bakers, and newspaper printers kept working. The city's engine ran continuously. New York was learning to exist around the clock, long before electricity would make it effortless. Night in 19th century New York was not simply the absence of day. It was a separate world with its own rules, dangers, and rewards. Gas lamps, taverns, and theaters created pockets of warmth and light within a city still largely ruled by shadow. To survive the night was to understand the city deeply, to know where to go, where not to look, and when to move on. In the darkness, New York revealed itself without pretense, and every morning, as daylight returned, the city carried the marks of the night quietly, relentlessly into another day of growth and struggle. Looking back at New York in the 1800s, it is tempting to search for inevitability to believe that the modern city was always destined to rise from those crowded streets and uncertain beginnings. But nothing about that transformation was guaranteed. The New York of dirt roads, open sewers, gang violence, and crushing labor was not a polished foundation. It was fragile, volatile, and frequently close to collapse. What makes its evolution remarkable is not that it succeeded, but that it survived long enough to change. The city's early instability forced adaptation. There were no perfect plans, no smooth transitions. Growth arrived faster than systems could manage it. Housing lagged behind population. Transportation struggled to keep pace with expansion. Law enforcement and public safety evolved only after repeated failure. Yet each breakdown revealed a need, and each need eventually produced innovation. Out of chaos came structure, slowly and unevenly. The working class, often invisible in grand histories, provided the city's true foundation. Their labor built roads, docks, factories, and homes. Their endurance sustained commerce through strikes, depressions, and disasters. Without their willingness or necessity to endure harsh conditions, New York could not have grown at the speed it did. Modern infrastructure stands on generations of exhaustion that went largely unrecognized. Immigration shaped the city's character more deeply than any single policy or leader. Newcomers brought languages, skills, traditions, and resilience. They clustered together, survived together, and eventually reshaped the city's culture from the inside. What began as ethnic enclaves became defining features of New York's identity. The city learned to absorb difference because it had no alternative. Diversity was not a slogan, it was survival. The sharp division between wealth and poverty also became a permanent feature. Fifth Avenue mansions and tenement overcrowding did not cancel each other out. They coexisted, feeding the same system. Industry required labor. Labor created profit. Profit demanded distance. This tension never resolved, but it did shape how New York understood itself as a city of opportunity that did not promise fairness. That paradox remains central to its identity today. Infrastructure transformed instability into movement. Horse cars, ferries, and railroads allowed the city to stretch without tearing itself apart. Transportation did more than connect neighborhoods, it created them. It changed how people measured distance, time, and possibility. The modern idea of commuting, of living in one place and working in another, was born from necessity. Today's subways and bridges trace their lineage directly to these early experiments. Public spaces like Central Park represented a turning point in how the city viewed human needs. For the first time, planners acknowledged that relentless productivity carried a cost. The park did not solve inequality or erase hardship, but it introduced the idea that a city must care for the mental and physical well-being of its people. This concept, radical at the time, would influence urban planning worldwide. The skyline's gradual rise reflected a shift in mindset. When New York began to build upward, it signaled confidence not just in engineering, but in permanence. Height meant belief in the future. Early towers and bridges were statements of intent. This city expected to last. The skyscrapers that would later define New York were not sudden inventions. They were the logical outcome of decades of testing limits. Crime, fire, and unrest left scars, but they also forced reform. Volunteer fire brigades gave way to professional departments. Corrupt systems were challenged, if imperfectly. Each disaster revealed weaknesses that could no longer be ignored. Modern governance emerged, not from idealism, but from necessity. The city learned by failing in public. Nightlife, danger, labor, ambition, all of it blended into a rhythm unique to New York. The city never belonged entirely to daylight or darkness. It became a place that operated continuously, adapting to constant pressure. That endurance, that refusal to pause, still defines the city's pace. What emerged from the 19th century was not a finished city, but a direction. New York learned how to grow without stopping, how to absorb people faster than it could plan, and how to reinvent itself after each crisis. These lessons became habits. By the time the 20th century arrived, the city was already practiced in transformation. Modern New York its skyline, diversity, intensity, and contradictions cannot be understood without this rough beginning. The city's strength lies not in its polish, but in its resilience. It was built by people who expected little comfort and demanded little recognition, yet created something far larger than themselves. The New York of today still carries the DNA of the 1800s, ambition without permission, inequality without illusion, and possibility without guarantee. It remains a city that challenges those who enter it, just as it did at the docks 2 centuries ago. This is the true legacy of that unstable past, not a myth of effortless greatness, but a reality forged through pressure, persistence, and adaptation. The modern city stands not because the early New York was perfect, but because it was tested, again and again, and endured.